So, yes, welcome everybody. Thank you all so much for making time at what is short notice, but I think in these strange times, it's happening a lot, but thank you for coming along to this. A few little bits of housekeeping. So we have muted, I believe, everybody as they come in. You can unmute yourself as you wish, but it might be easier to keep yourself muted if you're not talking or asking any questions. Videos are enabled, so if you want to keep them on, please do so. It's quite nice to look at faces, but if you do want to not appear in the video, then do turn it off. At this point, if you can use the chat function of Zoom to ask questions, please do that instead of unmuting yourself and asking. You might invite people who ask a question in the chat to unmute themselves and ask it. But for now, let's keep the chat function for the Q&A. Recordings, yes, as Claire says, we are recording these initial sessions for our own benefits when it comes to writing it up, so that's great. And this last one about please be mindful, well, we put that in because it's not the ideal environment to run a meeting like this, and there are parts of it which are a tad clunky, moving people from room to room. We just ask that you bear with us as we do it, but I'm sure I don't need to say that. Wonderful. So first of all, I'd like to thank a few people. So thanks to the immediate group of people who have helped put the thinking behind this together. I believe all of these people are online at the moment and will be playing some part in the meeting over the next few days. Special thanks to Lissy, Jane and Claire at the Newton Gateway for providing the infrastructure behind this. And then more broadly, a group of people who established this virtual forum for knowledge exchange in mathematical sciences as a response to the pandemic. It's a subset. This is a subset of people. So Dave, Caroline, Alan, Joe, and Dawn, and as well as people on that page as well. A lot of people have been involved in making sure that we can continue to do mathematical knowledge exchange even in these strange times. And yes, of course, everybody for coming. Thank you very much for making time. So what's today going to look like? So up until about 10:30, we're going to have a little bit of the background to the broad challenge that we're here to look at. You'll have seen it in some form in the pre-reading material that we sent out in advance. But at 9:45, for about 45 minutes, we're going to hear from a number of people who have very different perspectives on what unlocking university spaces means. I'll tell you who those are shortly. So those people will either pose direct challenges or give us some important considerations to think about when we're going through the next 3 days of discussions. There'll be a chance just around 10:30 for everybody to input some ideas of what they think this group could be looking at or should be looking at, either as a response to some of the short perspective pieces or their own perspective pieces that they think are important. So if people have a phone, a tablet or a laptop that they can enter some comments in, that's how we're going to collect that bit of information at 10:30. During the break, a number of the organisers are going to cluster some of these responses so that we can identify some key topics for each of the discussion groups. So then after the break, we'll reintroduce the priority topics as we've filtered through the responses that we've had, and take you through the next steps and how these topics could be addressed. Once we then know which group people want to go and discuss in, we will divide you into that group. And that again is the slightly clunky bit. So we'll probably have another impromptu break around 11:45 to get people into the rooms that we want to get people into. So after that, once people are in the rooms, there's a collaborative tool that we'll be using to kind of collate all this information and to guide people around the process of the discussion, so that the topics can be discussed, unpacked, and modelling work can be planned over the next few days from the discussions that take place for the rest of this afternoon. We'll then reconvene at 4 o'clock to see what people have been up to. So you'll have seen there's very little structure for the second 2 days, and that's kind of in keeping with the previous study groups that we've been running. We haven't set a lot of structure from the beginning, and I think this allows people to be a bit more flexible with other commitments they've got. Instead, once we've decided and collated the topics that we're going to look at, we'd ask the teams and the sub-teams to manage their time, and there's facilitators in each group who can help facilitate that as well. The Gateway staff can allocate as many breakout rooms as are required, and there's collaborative tools to help these discussions take place, and I'll go over those later in the morning. So I thought before we get on to this challenge, I'd invite David Abrahams just to comment a little bit on why we're looking at this particular problem, and also a little bit of the heritage and perhaps the way at which we've looked at this problem in the past, and whether there's any advice that perhaps Dave might give for how these groups might work. So over to you, Dave.
Thank you very much. Okay, so as Matt says, I'm David Abrahams. I'm the current director of the Isaac Newton Institute for Mathematical Sciences, which includes the Newton Gateway to Mathematics, which is notionally our knowledge exchange arm, but it facilitates interdisciplinary and broader research activity within the Institute. So we work very closely together, Matt and ICMS members and the rest of the Newton team, to try and get activities going as soon as we went into lockdown, to make sure that we're not in some sort of holding pattern, that we can actually make a contribution. So we've worked very closely with Rebecca Hoyle in particular, Chris Budd and Alan Chambliss, to try and make sure that we can connect to the mathematical sciences community and also more broadly. One of the things we've been doing is to virtualize study groups, and many of you will know the study group activities very well. Others, it's a little bit new, but it's really a forum for informal interaction between different, a broad set of community members to try and address particular problems. So it's challenge focused. Very early on in the progression or the creation of VCHEMS, this umbrella organization for doing this activity, we got an inquiry from the Department of Health and Social Care, not initially to our group, but to a bunch of mathematicians, and Ed Crane was one of those who's here in the membership this week. And they were saying, what mathematical rules can you think of which can make, to construct principles to advise government and others about unlocking the workplace? And it was really about, with limited knowledge, what can the mathematical sciences say in the way of guidance? So within a very, very short time, we managed to come up with a short report and then have a first virtual study group, which came up with a longer report with something like 21 principles which we can work on. And that we decided to socialize that more broadly than sending it just to the Department of Health and Social Care and another 5 departments. We thought of then trying to create a broader conversation with what we'd done. And that ended up being an open report, which then we had an online forum several weeks ago. And from that, SPI-M asked us to make a little presentation, which we did. And then following on that, Rebecca and a number of other people have said, well, let's take this one step further. Let's look at particular specific workplace environments and see how those principles can be taken a little step further to turn those into reality. I think it's fair to say that we're now thinking about specific challenges. So the briefing document you were supplied with gives you more information and starts getting specific, so we can address, really start thinking about the actual operation or predictions that you can make, not just about the principles. And that's the nature of this virtual study group this week, as I understand it. So I'd like to welcome all of those of you in our community here this week who aren't familiar with the setup, but I would urge you to think about using the variety of people that Matt and the Gateway team have put together to get the interactions going, because I think only by a plurality of views can we really make some interesting and you know, perhaps profound recommendations which can be picked up by others. I think we're amazed at how this topic has remained in the public arena ever since we were initially approached. It's a hot potato, and I think we can still make a very, very interesting contribution. So I'll be dipping in and out throughout the week because I've got many other things to do, but I wish I could join in more detail, but I'll try and be around as much as possible. But please get in touch if you have any questions or queries. And I think we want to make this as informal as possible, and hopefully the enabling mechanisms that we've got in place and the facilitators we have in place will help this to be successful. So with that, good luck and thank you very much. Back to you, Matt.
Thank you very much for that, Dave. So that sets a little bit of context on why we're looking at this particular topic. The challenge is, hopefully as you've seen it in the briefing material, but I think it's worth here then outlining the scale of the challenge and I guess the responsibility as well. As you'll know, there are 165 universities in the UK which collectively hold 2.4 million students and 500,000 staff, along with 500,000 contractors. That's about 3.5 million people directly, and the challenges from various levels of university life that we're going to hear shortly can bring this to life. But then the universities also don't operate in isolation, and the interaction with various parts of society and community need to be considered. And I hope that the way we've structured the groups and the group work are structured to appreciate this. One of the participants, Maurice Giodo, has kindly and helpfully prepared a short document on how we might consider responsible mathematical approaches to such an important challenge. Whilst we've tried to integrate these approaches into the structure of the sessions, please do try and find some time to have a look at this document. It's in a repository that you'll all be given access to when the session starts. So we're inviting people to stress test what's being said, think who else might need to be involved in some of these conversations who may not be here. I think during the 3 days, it is feasible that if you need to get in contact with a certain organisation or a certain individual, we may be able to bring them in to have a discussion. So don't let the group you're in constrain the thinking too much. If there's more people you want involved, then please reach out to myself and the Gateway, and I'm sure we could find some connections there if you want to bring them in to stress test some of the assumptions and the ideas you're making. And importantly, think about how we might communicate and visualize some of these approaches that we're talking about here. So there's a little bit more detail in the briefing document around the challenge. So we've received various levels of challenges in advance of this, and it's likely that this challenge here around how would cohorts effectively work in a university environment will form the basis of some of the group's discussions. But with a selection of other perspective pieces and topics being introduced this morning, these will likely be augmented, perhaps changed during the discussion. So I won't go too much into that because I know we have people who are able to talk more authoritatively to these topics than myself. But I guess these are the wider considerations than just cohorting students. It's around professional services, transport to and from campus, and around the interaction with the universities, local communities of staff and students. So that's all I'm going to say at this point. Oh no, it's not, there is one more. So the way we've structured this session is a little arbitrary, but I hope it makes some sense in that we're going to have one group looking at the kind of challenges which are building level challenges, so the kind of things that happen in rooms and corridors. One that's more campus, so interaction across various buildings and social activities on campus, and then another group looking at how all of this kind of links together with the wider community. Now, these are a little bit arbitrary distinctions, but each group is asked to consider how what they're talking about links to these other levels of these other levels. So with that, because we've got more perspective pieces than I initially thought we would have, oh yeah, there is a bonus point for anyone who knows what university campus that is, and I think there is somebody who works there, so that's possibly cheating, Dave. That is Manchester University campus, very well noticed. So we have nine people who are going to talk. Some people's time is limited, so we'll start with this straight away. So I won't go through them all because we'll go through them each individually. So why don't we start with Luke Maggs, who is at Natural Resource Wales. So Luke, if you're able to unmute yourself and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about some of the challenging topics you think we could be considering here. Over to you, Luke.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. Thank you, Matt and David, for the introduction. My name's Luke Maggs. I'm the lead operational researcher at Natural Resources Wales. And for those that don't know, NRW, Natural Resources Wales, was formed as an amalgamation of the Countryside Council for Wales, the then Forestry Commission for Wales, and the Environment Agency in Wales. So we have a devolved approach to the natural environment. What that basically means in practice is we're an organisation of about 1,900 people across the country. We were formed in early 2013. The reason I'm here today was I joined in on the webinar that David was talking about earlier around the guiding principles for unlocking the workforce. And it was just at the moment in time when we were looking internally at some of our services in response to COVID. So obviously we are all home working where possible, but we have a really unusual function, which is what I want to talk to you today about briefly. We have our National Laboratory Service, which was as part of a memorandum of understanding with Swansea University in 2017, we formed our laboratory services on the actual campus. So on the Faraday building in Swansea University on the second floor, NRW has its function in laboratory. And what that means in practice is we've got about 40 members of staff who are based there. I've shared with Matt, which I hopefully will be shared with you guys afterwards, but one of our documents called our response measures to COVID-19, which was us trying to look at how we maintain some form of operational readiness within our laboratory. And the reason we need to do that is because we are an incident responder for things like large scale pollution, flood events, air quality. We do a variety of kind of saline ground and river water analysis. Obviously our lab has been pretty much on skeleton crews since the crisis hit. We have had to maintain some readiness, but we're not operational, but we are still having people on campus. So in that document, what we've tried to do, and I've just shared this morning more detailed floor plans with Matt as well, so hopefully those can go around, but we've been just trying to think about what kind of the issues around social distancing and how we kind of manage services in the lab. And there's a few interesting angles here, both from the kind of mathematical sciences, but also that interaction with the behavioral sciences around issues of compliance. So, we've looked at, and the document details a lot around some of our thinking around access and egress of rooms and corridors. We've tried to map out safe social distance zones. We've looked at things like the air conditioning unit. So obviously with a lab service, we need a big HVAC system. Where's the air being sourced from? How does that make staff members kind of feel when they're in the offices? We do have, and I'm not sure whether you're picking this up as part of it, but we do have quite an interesting dynamic in the UK at the moment where there are different rules in terms of distancing between Wales and England. And what that starts to mean for us on a campus is that a lot of our samples are delivered by courier services. So we need to deal with national organizations at like a head office level. We're having difficulties in ensuring that the paperwork is filtering down to the various contractors. We're quite fortunate with the lab that it's effectively spread over 2 wings. So we have a kind of like east and west wing to the building. We're trying to keep, as best we can, staff working in the concept of social bubbles and looking at kind of cohorts of staff, but that's fine within the lab and where we can control things. It's more difficult when there's guidance applied to where you take break times, who you socially interact with at break times, even just things like the transportation to and from work. We're having, obviously the majority of staff are traveling in via car wherever possible, but we do have a few members of staff who are going to be traveling in via public transport. We've tried to engage staff along the way whilst designing these plans. So the document that you're going to hopefully have a look at today will show this has been discussed with members of staff. So staff themselves have some flexibility and discretion to tweak the rules and parameters depending on whether or not they're working with X number of contractors. We've started to have a look at things around how we actually interact with staff on the campus. I suppose ultimately for us, really, we are maintaining some form of operational readiness. One of our big fears is that all of this kind of work and processing has been done on the concept of 2 meters social distancing. I'm sure you've all picked up on the news over the weekend. There seems to be a political push to look at a reduction in that. If that happened tomorrow, how do we adapt and respond to our plans, and how do we cope with some of these changing issues? Particularly around compliance, I wanted to re-stress that again. We're dealing with very analytical staff in an analytical capacity, and even then we're finding some situations where people aren't quite following the rules exactly, and that's to be expected. But it does mean then we're needing to deal with, how we fill in the assessnet entries for health and safety. So I think I mean, hopefully the document that I've been able to share with you in advance gives a bit of an overview. Obviously, our problem is a very small element within your much bigger issue that Matt's already talked about. 2.4 million people across the UK. We're talking about 40 members of staff in the NRW lab, of which at the moment we're only able to put a maximum 15 in the building. So we're already well less than 50% capacity. So I think we're really just looking for a little bit of feedback on whether we're on the right track, whether our kind of guiding principles are, or you would agree with it. I can't stay for the whole event as much as I'd love to, but Matt and Lizzie both have my contact details, and I'm more than happy to take questions via email, and I will try and dial back in if that's okay. I appreciate we've got quite a bit to get through, so I'll stop now unless there's any burning questions.
Thank you, Luke. I think you said you may be available to get hold of at 12 o'clock for an hour or so.
Yeah, I might be able to dial back in for a little bit of time there.
So wonderful. Thank you very much. I think we'll hold off questions for now, if that's all right, Luke, so we can move on and make sure we fit everybody in. Thank you for that, Luke. Next up, we have Richard Middleton. So Richard, if you're able to unmute yourself, that'd be fantastic. So Richard is Chief Operating Officer at the University of Southampton. So over to you, Richard.
Matt, thanks very much. And I hope I'm unmuted now and you can hear. Great. And thank you very much for inviting me to join the discussion. I apologize that this will be a brief and I hope not too breathless set of questions and comments, but I'm delighted to be listened to in these circumstances. My interest was started by Rebecca Hoyle, who I think is on the call in the group, and reading the paper circulated on looking at how mathematics can help universities think about returning to campus. And I found that very interesting and provocative paper. And I also passed it on to my son, who's a recent graduate, who was also very interested in thinking, how does this apply from the perspective of a student? So my thoughts have benefited from his and others' discussions as students on how might that work from their perspective. Just to give you some numbers, different scale from Luke, we've got 6,000 students in accommodation, about 20,000 coming to the campus, and 6,000 staff. We want to make the campus operate as normally as possible from the autumn, and therefore finding ways to manage the flows and movements and behaviors of those large numbers of people in the context of COVID to reduce the incidence and risk of infection is terribly important to us. So a number of questions for you in the modeling, if I may. First, is there a difference between staff and students in the modeling? And if so, why? Obviously, there are key things about age and behavior and therefore risk of infection, and might those change the nature of the modeling outputs? I'm very interested in the ideas around cohorts, bubbles, and islands as set out in the principles paper. Obviously, given the scale of the campus and the number of students involved, I'm very interested in the idea of size of cohorts, bubbles, and islands, and what are the rate limiting factors on the size. I've seen one university describe a possible bubble of 6. Well, that isn't going to work. Given the scale of our university. So how big can you make a bubble before it, as it were, collapses as an organizing principle for maintaining the safety of those inside it? Second question around cohorts and bubbles, what about leakage? Clearly, a university isn't an entirely closed community and people move in and out. So what's the degree of leakage that's possible before, again, a bubble collapses? Third set of questions is, can you incorporate both social and academic life in the modeling, please? This is one of the inputs very strongly from my son and his friends, is that coming to university isn't just about attending the lectures, the seminars, the being able to study in groups. It's also about social life. And the ideal social life is different from your academic and teaching life. So there's different groups of people involved there. How can the concept accommodate that? Fourth set of questions is around changing the membership of bubbles and islands. Again, what degree of flexibility is there before the concept collapses? And then my final question challenge is around the impact of testing and tracing. To what extent does that change the parameters of modeling, and therefore to what degree should we be putting in significant effort as a university into testing, tracing, and then isolating known positive cases in order to increase the efficacy of other measures, such as grouping people in bubbles and islands? That was it was a bit breathless still, but that was my set of questions, provoked from reading the paper and doing some thinking, and posing the questions of how do we run as normal as possible a campus come autumn. And I say farewell at this point, and I hope to come back at points during the meeting. But thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Richard. I have those noted down and we'll feed those into the conversations. Wonderful. Thank you,
Great.
Richard.
Bye.
Bye. So next we have, I'm not sure if this is a double act. Gemma and Charlotte, correct me if it isn't. But we have Gemma Wilkins and Charlotte Lewis from the University of Warwick. If Gemma,
yeah, I can kick off if you like, give a bit of context.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Sure. So I'm Gemma Wilkins. I am Assistant Registrar for the Business Continuity and Recovery Programme at University of Warwick. So it's a programme that was set up initially to ensure business as usual as far as possible during the lockdown period, and then to plan the recovery. It covers a whole range of functions within the university, so teaching and learning being the key one, a lot of support for blended and online learning, looking at research and how we get our research staff back onto campus, but also all of the functions of the university, so things like admissions, recruitment, student and staff well-being, IT provision, and of course estates. So we are a large campus community. We have a lot of students living on site, but also a huge number of students that are off-site. And under normal circumstances, we would also have members of the public coming onto our campus. So it's usually quite a kind of fluid community setting with a lot of people passing through. So my role in the programme is essentially one of a conduit between our functional areas within the university and the programme board, which is our decision-making body for different aspects of our recovery plan. And we have a number of different challenges that we're looking at. So Richard had already mentioned quite a few that look familiar to us, but perhaps we might have some extra ones to add in there. And we're kind of hoping that over the next few days, we might get a bit more context for the decisions that we need to make to unblock some of those kind of key areas and take things forward. We understand that the work that this group's doing shouldn't be understood as a kind of concrete advice for decision making, but hopefully it will give us a few things that we can take away and kind of progress a bit further in terms of our thinking. So that's a little bit of an overview, but if it's okay, I will now hand over to my colleague Charlotte, who'll be able to give a little bit more detail from a state's perspective of some of the challenges we're looking at.
Okay, so I'm Charlotte Lewis. I work as Head of Strategic Programmes and Governance in Estate. So that's essentially an estate strategy role, also master planning and anything else anybody else doesn't want to do. I'm currently looking at the capacity planning of the site and thinking, how on earth do we plan how many students we can get onto campus safely? So teaching space is a fairly obvious one, and we can look at plans and say, well, we can accommodate this sort of percentage. But we've got a lot of other things that are highly interconnected with that, particularly things like study space and how much is available. Particularly if we're running a reduced teaching programme, then how much more study space do we need, because we've got people on our campus university that we need to accommodate. And where will they dwell between learning events? And how do we work out how much capacity we need for them to attend online lectures as well at the same time? Then we have a particular issue at Warwick over transport to campus. So of our 26,000 students, we know that about 9,000 live in Leamington Spa and come by bus every day. We have particular transport issues anywhere as a campus, with lots and lots and lots of congestion getting to and from campus. So we want to overall in the long term discourage people to come in their cars. And we've got a big program on trying to shift them modally into other means of transport like public transport. So this is quite interesting at this time where that might not be possible. So transport is a big one, and the bottleneck that we have on buses coming from Leamington Spa in particular. General mobility around campus. So do we need to control how many people we have on site, and how would we go about doing that? And then obviously the details of offices and research spaces, but also I'm interested to know what modelling we could do that could look at loading and unloading of lecture theatres and the like, and particularly where we've got lots of teaching spaces in one place. How do you work that out, and how do you work out what the impact is on a timetable if you need to space teaching events further apart, and whether that actually makes overall your capacity worse on campus or better? Because does that mean if you spread it all out that you've then got more people on campus for longer? And then there are some little things around facilities, toilets and kitchens and lifts and those kind of things, and whether those are actually your bottleneck in terms of how many people you have on campus. We've got some Wi-Fi data that tells us we reckon we have about 27,000 people a day on site. What proportion of those can we allow on site? Would 50% be a reasonable number, reckoning on social distancing? How would we work that out? How would we model that? Any answers would be great.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Charlotte and Gemma. That's fantastic. So next up, though, I think we'll do a quick shift around for somebody's availability. So Stephen, I wonder if you'd like to come in at this point. I know you have a limited availability, and I don't think our estates person is here quite yet. So Stephen, if you can unmute yourself and give your 5 minutes, that would be fantastic.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. And thanks for the opportunity to spend a few minutes just talking to colleagues. So I'm Stephen McAuliffe. I'm the Deputy Registrar for the University of Nottingham, and I'm part of the university's response team to COVID-19. And by that, the return to campus, I suppose, is perhaps the subtitle to that. The university, large campus-based university, 35,000 students in the UK, another 5,000 in Malaysia, and 8,000 in China. So we're quite a distributed institution. The challenges that I'll highlight are probably in three categories. They're about students living, students learning, and students belonging. And these are pretty crucial elements for a campus-based institution of the type that Nottingham is. In terms of living, the first challenge, and other colleagues have mentioned this, rests on things like accommodation. How do we support students in our halls of residence, particularly given round about half of our halls are traditional, in that they have long corridors with shared toilets, dining rooms where they sit down and eat in formal dining times, and the other half of ours are the flats that lend themselves rather nicely to small groups. So we have a challenge there in how we develop that. We have a huge campus, 300-acre parkland campus, our main campus, University Park, in the UK. That gives us lots of opportunities to use that space while it's not raining, and indeed hopefully at the start of the year it won't be tipping it down quite as much as it might later. But it also gives us some challenges around people flows, because what it means is there's some central points that students would go to around certain buildings where different services are offered, and so we have that challenge of how do we manage flows of people around in different locations in a way that can keep those locations safe and they don't just centre around a couple of spaces. So there's some interesting challenges for us around how we also report that back to students in real time, so they can see it's busy there at the moment, I won't go there. So how does that sort of thing work for us? The learning point, central to any university experience, obviously. The university balancing with blended learning, looking at both online and in-person lectures, but some emerging challenges there where lots of different routes to try and mitigate against COVID-19 are being adopted. And the sum of those routes may actually really damage a student's experience if we're not careful. And what I mean by that is quite reasonably a school will think, well, let's redo our programme to support COVID-19 and social distancing. So at one level, they might remove a certain number of modules. The next thing they'll do is say, right, let's have some of it online. And then the next thing they'll do is say, well, let's teach it a little bit later. And then the next thing we'll do, we'll say, well, let's have more seminar groups so we can have more social distancing. And very, very quickly, we've got a sum of mitigations that actually are not necessary. It may only be one of those mitigations is the right thing to do. And so that challenge of what is the right thing to do when faced with this level of uncertainty is a real issue for us, because we don't want to pile them all on top of one another, because that ultimately will be a problem for the students, even though it's all done for the right reasons. So that's the challenge for us there. Within that, you have the timetable conundrum, and colleagues already mentioned that, so I won't go over it again, just that point around different time starts, scheduling to avoid each other, etc., etc. The final point I mentioned is belonging, and really that's crucial and links back to the first two. We know students pick a university of a campus-based university, a traditional university like Nottingham, because of the experience they get as part of their time here, and we've got to try and preserve that. We know that all means things like Freshers Week and events and activities, and suddenly we're looking at this social distancing point around how can we run activities safely? How can we support students to develop a sense of identity at the university? How can they play sport against one another? How can we have intramural sport between the accommodation, etc., etc., etc.? So that's a challenge for us. What we also have is a challenge of what's often called Freshers' Flu. How do we respond to that when Freshers' Flu goes around the university and half the population are convinced they've got COVID-19 and actually they've just got a cold? And so for us, that's a particular challenge. How do we differentiate quickly? How do we respond quickly? And how do we align with the external testing processes? And then the final point is one around mental health and well-being that we need to look at. We know students are going to experience perhaps direct loss, members of family, friends and so forth from the terrible virus, but they'll also experience a loss of their A-levels, of their final year at school, and then they're coming to university and not quite sure what to expect. Are they going to see it as another loss? And so how are our services going to be able to respond to potentially thousands of people going through that process and needing some support from counsellors, from wellbeing officers, or just colleagues? I mean, it's often just friend-to-friend stuff that we need to try and support, and that ties to motivation, and that's our final concern against the mental health issue, which is around about 60% of our students in a survey that's still open ask students what are they finding most challenging around COVID-19, and the biggie was motivation. That was it, 60% saying motivation is the concern to them. Well, of course, as we peel off some of the extrinsic motivations like scheduled lectures, seeing the lecturer at the front of the room, having the one-to-one support, having the seminar, those extrinsic motivators are being removed. And so how does a student then stay focused and be successful at university if actually they're 18, their intrinsic motivation isn't yet as strong as it might be if they were 55? So how do we do that? So there are our challenges that we're working through at the moment.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Stephen. Really interesting. So, and I wonder now if we can head back to Maurice, if you're able to unlock yourself as Director of Estate Operations at University of Southampton.
Hi there, can you hear me okay?
You can indeed, wonderful.
Right, yeah, so I believe I've got 5 minutes, so I thought I'd just quickly, my running order will be my role, and I'll be doing this conversation from an estates perspective. Just describe what we did as we entered the lockdown, how we've gone through the lockdown, how we're now bringing ourselves out the other side, out of hibernation, and then future plans and focuses, if that's okay. So my role at Southampton, I look after all things in the estates and facilities team that are of an operational nature. So that's building engineering, catering, cleaning, security, grounds, post-portering, the DLO really, everything in estates except for residential and capital projects. So as we entered the lockdown, very challenging time, we were following the government advice, really looking after the people in the team, trying to make sure that they're all okay, whilst making sure that the students and our customers in the academic in the faculties were looked after. So it was very challenging. We had a number of I guess a lot of faculties wanted to carry on in some respects because research is important to them. And there was quite a lot of uncertainty as we entered that time. People were worried, that sort of thing. So it was trying to, with the sort of 200 or 300 buildings we've got, it was trying to really understand which buildings were going to close and when, and what we were going to do to them from an engineering point of view and from a service perspective on the campus. So we got through that, and we reached the stage where on campus, literally the team, the security team were running fully as they would normally do. But pretty much everybody else was off site, with the exception, we took our engineering team down to a much reduced level. I think we had, we put it on a shift. So some people would come in the morning and some would come in the afternoon. Security were there all the time, as I said. And catering, we closed that down. In terms of what was on the campus, we've got a number of researchers looking into COVID, so they were in their building and they were working as usual, really. And then we've had this period of lockdown. The only people we furloughed in our team were the catering and conferences team, because they're part of a trading account. It was deemed as something that we couldn't do to furlough people such as engineers and portering staff, because they're in some ways directly funded by the government. So we weren't able, or the decision was made not to furlough them. Now, the current place we're in is we're coming out of lockdown. So we've got various different people in different places. We've got people who think we should all be back there as normal. And we've got people who are scared, who don't want to come back. So we're managing all these different expectations. And what we're doing at the moment is we're in the process of coming out of hibernation on a priority basis. I've still got the majority of the team not on site in terms of government guidelines, as in it's not a priority to have everybody back on site. I am working in a heavily unionised environment with my team, so I have to be very careful in terms of how I manage their expectations. So we're still at quite a reduced level, but we're slowly increasing the number of people who are coming back on site. And we're currently we've agreed a plan. Our Chief Operating Officer is leading a plan in that each faculty and each building occupier is putting together operational plans and risk assessments and method statements that are being reviewed by myself, the Chief Operating Officer, and the Director of Health and Safety, so that we're all happy with those before we approve them. And at the same time, my engineering director is making sure all the buildings are compliant and that they're ready, and the soft services director is making sure that cleaners are on site, that we've got adequate supply of antibacterial wipes and so on. And we've got plans. We've had various groups who've been working throughout the COVID lockdown. There's a gold group, which is our university executive board and executive directors and deans. Silver group, which is myself, the Chief Operating Officer, Health and Safety Director, and so on. And then bronze groups sit within each faculty and each key professional service area. So that's how we've been controlling and using our chain of command throughout this process. And then there's been spin-off groups from the silver, where we've gone away and we've written up different processes. So there's one process that looks at how will we manage research on campus, what about teaching, continued off-site working. So those processes have all been raised and issued. We use Teams as a depository for all this information. So we've got 6 or 7 buildings open now. We're kind of opening up for research. That's our big focus at the moment. And then we're now looking at bringing teaching back in late September, but in socially distanced mode. And that's a big project. The Executive Director of Estates and Facilities, who's my manager, he's owning that process pan-university. So he's forming a multidisciplinary team. And I'm looking currently, the big focus for me is about how we track this so that everybody is really clear about what decisions have been made, which rooms are operational, and so on. And I think we're looking at the September thing now. It was a decision that was made the week before last, and we're getting our heads around that at the moment. How are we going to do it? And I think the main decision we've made is we're engaging with an external consultant to help us with all the modelling that's going to be needed, so that we can actually understand how many people we can get to the campus, we can accommodate on campus, and then maybe which subjects that involves. And there'll be much debate on that before we communicate all that to our students. So that's the hectic journey I've been on for the last 13 weeks, I think it is, apparently. So it's a very operational view, how we've done it. I hope that is useful.
That's very helpful. Thank you very much for that, Maurice. Move on now to Amanda Chetwin from University of Lancaster. Amanda, if you're able to unmute yourself.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can indeed, thank you.
Thank you. So good morning, everyone. I was Pro-Vice Chancellor for the student experience at Lancaster for 14 years until I decided that was quite long enough in September last year. I'm also actually a professor of mathematics. So for me, unlocking, Matt, sorry, you're going to pop the slide up for me? It's not, that's it, perfect, thank you. So I was just going to say a few things about things from the student perspective. So the student experience is clearly designed to help students reach their full potential. And that means not just the curriculum, but we want them to enjoy the rest of the time and get the best they can from everything at university, which some of the other speakers have also spoken about. So it's thinking about this particular student activities, and I'm going to highlight some of the things that will become issues because of COVID-19. So for many new students, Welcome Week is an essential part of their induction to university life. It helps them settle in, it helps make new friendships. And for many universities on this conference call, they've got a lot of students. We have 5,000 at Lancaster, practically all our first years, sorry, 5,000 students living on campus. We've got 15,000 students altogether, but most of our first years will live on campus. So this campus experience is really important to them when they choose a university with a campus. And the accommodation is usually arranged so that students mix together. We don't put them in subject groups. And so trying to think about how much we would lose if we did just put students in a little bubble that they were taught in and they lived in, that seems to be really against what we're trying to do. Then Welcome Week has a big whole week of large group activities, again helping students to get to know each other. How can we do that safely? What sort of activities could we arrange rather than the usual ones? And actually it's a good opportunity because many of the usual ones would include large numbers going on bar crawls. So maybe there's an opportunity here to think of a different way. I can see the registrars smiling. This is an issue for many of us. Okay, so that's a bit about Welcome Week. Teaching styles. Many universities have already thought about opportunities to move away from the large lecture presentations, which of course traditionally had limited opportunities for engagement. But some face-to-face teaching will surely happen. And what's the best way of doing that face-to-face teaching? Is it a very tiny group meeting very rarely, or is it larger groups and then being able to meet more frequently? So I think some understanding of the issues that for small group teaching and what are the safest and best ways of doing that. Then I was going to say something about building community. There's a picture of our Freshers' Fair. Well, clearly that's not going to happen. But all these activities that students do in their spare time at university, which ones can we continue to do safely? Which ones will we have to adapt? And which ones just won't happen at all? So our Students' Union puts on about 200 different societies and clubs. And they range from baking, role play, archery, hockey. Some of them are clearly, obviously, probably easily adaptable, and others not so. But getting some principles so students' unions can think about which activities can be done safely. Then something about learning spaces. So somebody's already mentioned, I think it was Charlotte, that we know students work on group projects occasionally, but actually much more commonly, they're working together in groups, doing their own work, but sitting alongside each other. They like to be together, they like the group working spaces we've set up in libraries and all over the campus. So how do we allow for that and yet make it safe for students? What number of students can work together, and what extra precautions will we need to take? And then my final point was about reassuring students. If you look at some of the surveys about prospective students, some of the issues they're talking about is how safe is it going to be? They want to know what the plans are, but they also want to know what are the plans if there's a second wave of COVID comes across. How do we, when they're already with us, how do we make it safe for them then? So we need to be able to think about communicating future plans as well. And then all the way through, we've got to be thinking about the clinically vulnerable students. Universities spend great efforts to try and make sure all students are included. And this group of students is going to find it particularly difficult, and we need to make sure there's activities and things for them too. So just a few ideas. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amanda. That's fantastic. Now, our next 5 minutes was from Will Williams. I can't see him on the list. I wonder if Will's here under a different name. If not, we'll try and get Will back at some point. In the meantime, Helen, I know you're struggling with people digging up your road outside, but should we see if we can hear you?
I still seem to be here now.
Okay,
so
yes,
let's give it a go. Right, so I'm the head of UCL's maths department. A lot of the issues that people have been talking about around student accommodation and all of that are simply not within my remit, which I have to say is a bit of a relief. The priorities that I've been facing looking forward to September are how to make a new student cohort feel that they are a cohort if they're all distanced and a lot of their teaching is happening remotely. And linked to that, how to incorporate our new staff. So we've got 3 or 4 people who have started since we went into lockdown. And at the moment, nobody knows them. And unless we do something really active, nobody will know them. And they won't feel as if they are part of our department. And there's a sense in which you think, well, what does it even mean to be part of a department if you are, for instance, a research fellow? You could be anywhere, right? And you can be interacting with researchers all over the world. So what are we adding to them by them being part of our department? The other top priority is our teaching. It's clear that the large lecture theatres that have been our usual mode of teaching, certainly in the first couple of years, where we have, I was teaching 275 people at once last term. We can't do that. Nowhere to do that with anything approaching social distancing, never mind the fact that everybody's all in one room breathing into the enclosed air for an hour. There's no room big enough to take that many students, so we have to do something else. And it's clear that our lecture equivalent is going to be something provided online, and then there will be some sort of small group, face-to-face, something to support it, which may be modified from what it has been previously. So the challenges facing us as a department are, how do we do that and make sure that we're providing an educational experience that is better than what you could get on Coursera or any other MOOC? How do we get our more senior staff to see the opportunity that this has to transform our teaching long term, and not just to see it as something where they're going to record something that looks like their lecture, stick it online, expect to do a tutorial in the usual way, which will be a much substandard student experience. That's going to take a lot of effort. How do we do all of that without killing off everybody's research, which is for a lot of people the motivating factor that brings them in? How do we use our clinically vulnerable staff, of whom we have a few, people who need to shield and who are not coming out of their house, not going on public transport? How do we best use them so that they still feel part of the department and they're still participating in the student experience? How do we deal with students in different time zones? We will almost certainly have students in China next year who can't get back because of lockdowns in one place or another. And how do we manage the teaching in such a way that they can access it even though they're not even in the same time zone as the rest of us? A lot of that is not particularly amenable to the sort of things that this study group can discuss, but that's the reality of the challenges that I'm facing. In terms of things that I think it would be really helpful to have from this group, we have an admin staff office where the students come with all their questions. How do we manage that and make it safe for the staff? Because the way it currently works simply isn't. And I can't at the moment see what to do to replace it with something that does the same job, but doesn't just expose staff to huge amounts of risk. And what do we do with our face-to-face teaching? We would usually have small group tutorials, like 6 students, in our offices, but that's extremely close together. We can presumably, to some extent, get the lecture theatres that are not being used for lectures, but the numbers of small group tutorials that we will need are so much larger than the numbers of lectures that would have been giving, that there just won't be rooms. So do we move those face-to-face interactive sessions online? And if we do, how do students ever feel that they're not just on the end of a computer, and why have they even bothered to come to London? If we do make them face-to-face, or some of them face-to-face, how do we incorporate the students who can't get back from China? Do we end up with tutor groups that are entirely made of Chinese students, which I think for those students removes one of the advantages that they wanted from London, which is to interact with British students and improve their English and become part of the culture and sample it all? There's a lot of detailed challenges around that, and the mixed virtual and physical teaching, I think, is genuinely challenging. Again, that's not something that this group can consider. The virtual people don't take any part in COVID risk, which is an advantage of them, but it is a big challenge, and I think mixed groups are quite difficult to run. But really our biggest question is, how can we implement small group, by which I mean up to 10 students, in any way that doesn't involve having an enormous room every time, because I don't think we can get an enormous room every time. And I think that's it. The state of us at the moment is that as a department, we're still fully locked because those people who are working on COVID priority research can do it remotely, and so everybody's doing it remotely. We've just reached the stage where individuals are allowed in one at a time to collect the things from their offices that they wish they'd taken home in March. And my next big job is to do the risk assessment about reopening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen, for that. That's wonderful. So that nicely to time gets us to the next part of the session. So with all that, and there's a lot there, I understand that there's a huge amount that we've been told about specific problems to look at and constraints that we need to consider. The next part of this is to take some of the things that we've heard, and you may have your own topics that you want to put into this, and assemble these into an online board, and I'll show you how we're going to do that in a second. And then in the break that will be in about 5-10 minutes, a group of us will divide those topics between where it naturally fits. Is it a building level problem? Is it a campus level problem? Or is it broader than that? And we'll prioritize them, or we'll come up with perhaps 3 or 4 broad challenges for each of those rooms to look at. And then there will be an exercise for each of those topics for those individual groups to look at each of these topics and discuss them to understand what it is over the next couple of days we'll be able to do. So, right, this is where technology may fail us, but let's try it. So hopefully people have a device that they're able to access this website here, www.menti.com. And if you go there, you should be asked to put in a 6-digit code, which is 598869. Now I'm about to move off this page, so let me pop it in the chat, that code. So once you have that, I should be able to move to this page here. So hopefully this is what you see when you log into that. Can somebody just do a hands up, a wave, unmute themselves and say, yes, you can see that page? If you can see that page. Thank you very much, Kabul, that's great. So whilst people are logging into that, again, all the details to log into that are at the top of the page there, so menti.com, then a 6-digit code. I'm going to move us along so you can see what you're supposed to do. Now, this first one is an icebreaker, and it really is just to make sure you understand how to interact with this. So the first one is, yeah, good, right answers coming in straight away, fantastic. So if people can spend 30 seconds, so we're confident we have enough people on here who are able to interact with this, that would be great. How many people are on the call? 37. So hopefully be happy if we got up to around 30 responses would be good. Okay. Yes, good. I think unless anyone's having real problems, we can move on to the actual question, though I'm happy to say this is the right answer. So the real question then is, what are the topics that we want to discuss? So that should have moved you on in your screen. You should have a new page where you're able to type in new problems. So we've taken a few problems that have been posed from other universities and other people. If people are able to put in either reflections on what has already been discussed by some of our speakers or people's own problems, that would be fantastic. So we could spend 5 minutes or so typing some of these in. So I don't know if some of the speakers just want to summarize what they said and pop those in. Else, others on the call are able to put those in as well. So if people aren't able to put anything in because they can't get on this, just drop something in the chat to me and I'll enter it in for you. So we've got 22 responses so far. That's a fantastic start. I don't know, Dave Abrahams, are you still on the line in case you wanted to add an extra perspective on running an international research institute in a university? Did you have any thoughts or things that you wanted to add into this while we're doing the typing? just as a bit of,
not really.
I wasn't going to say background noise, but you know, just some
yeah, mood music.
Mood music, yeah.
I don't think there's anything really any more different about what I run as an institute as opposed to anyone else, except that we, as a research visitor institute, we are very international. So our constraints are very much related to how open the world is to transport and the issues associated with transport, about getting people in and out. But also I think we need to think about how flexible whatever we come up with in terms of recommendations as to changing government concerns. So if there is a second wave of the outbreak, how can we easily adjust whatever we come up with to make it sort of manageable in the circumstances? So I think that is something. I think had I thought a little bit more about it, I would have thought that Oxford and Cambridge have their colleges, which have their own individual problems associated with it, and of course many of them have antiquated accommodation. So sharing facilities amongst students is always an issue. That affects my institute to the same extent as well, with the accommodation that we provide for the visitors.
Thanks, Dave. And I think there's some comments in the chat, I think. Okay. So we're at 63. Okay, that's a fair amount of responses. Thank you very much, people who are still entering these. On the timeline, on the agenda, we gave ourselves half an hour as a break for everybody, except for a few volunteers who said they'd help put some of these into some overarching themes that groups could look at, and then to segment these into 3 different groups. So why don't we do that? So the time is now 1 minute over what we said it would be. That's not bad, but we're still getting quite a few responses. Why don't we stick to the time that we suggested? So we'll break now for half an hour, come back at 11:05. Those who said they were happy to help understand how to cluster these, could you raise your hand so that Claire is able to put myself and those people into any of the breakout rooms? Claire, would be great, if that's all right.
Yeah.
And with that, we can feel free to keep entering these, but do also grab a break, because there's quite a lot to discuss when we come back.
Do you want me to send you off now, Matt?
Yes. So when I get sent off, I presume my screen will stop sharing. So it's probably safest to stop entering now, because you won't be able to see what's being presented now. So thank you very much for that, Claire. If you're happy to put us all in a breakout room, that would be great. Oh, and Kirsty Bolton wants to come in.